The mountains were still black shapes against the pre-dawn sky when the Taliban fighters climbed onto a rocky ridge overlooking the Shah-i-Kot Valley. A thin frost clung to the stones. Their breath hung in clouds. Below them, the world lay quiet, too quiet for their liking. They had been told the Americans were coming. They had heard stories of helicopters that roared in low, kicking up dust storms and blasting rockets at fleeing fighters. They had survived those before. So when one of the younger men spotted a distant shape in the sky, drifting like a slow-moving insect far to the east, the ridge erupted with amused chatter. "It is nothing," an older fighter muttered. "These American helicopters must come close to be dangerous." The others nodded. They had fought the Soviets in these same mountains. They learned that helicopters, no matter who flew them, shared the same weaknesses. They were loud, vulnerable, and forced to reveal themselves. An aircraft that stayed far away could not harm them. Mountain walls blocked line of sight, and a helicopter's weapons, they believed, could not reach into the valleys with any real accuracy. They had no fear of the silhouette on the horizon. The Apache AH-64 hung there, barely visible through the morning haze. Its rotors thumped softly, swallowed by the mountain's jagged walls. It wasn't closing in. It wasn't descending. It didn't even seem interested in them. A few fighters laughed openly at its laziness. But the Americans in the cockpit were not watching the fighters on the ridge. They had already marked a fortified position the Taliban believed invisible from the sky. An underground firing point cut into the rock, its entrance concealed by a rusted sheet of metal and a scattering of loose stones. Fighters had used it for months to ambush patrols. Sniper fire had come from there more than once, and today, someone inside was preparing for another ambush. The Apache's crew did not approach. They didn't need to. A coded laser designation washed across the mountainside, invisible to the naked eye. The helicopter's sensors saw everything: heat signatures in the cave, weapons stacked near the entrance, movement behind the rocks. The Taliban fighters on the ridge never heard the missile launch. The Hellfire left its rail miles away, so distant the sound was swallowed before it could reach them. It carved a glowing line across the sky, descending with absolute precision toward a target the fighters believed was untouchable. Inside the cave, a man adjusting the sights on a PKM machine gun never sensed the danger. The explosion was a brutal flash. One moment silence, the next a towering burst of fire and pulverized stone that lit the valley wall like a false sunrise. A shockwave rolled across the ridge. Dust and debris rained down on the Taliban fighters, knocking several off balance. The laughter died instantly. A second Hellfire followed, then a third. The fortified position they trusted, the sniper's refuge they used again and again, simply ceased to exist. Rock, metal, and bodies were thrown outward in a cloud of smoke. Only then did the fighters on the ridge realize the terrible truth. The helicopter had never needed to approach them. Its missiles reached farther than sound. Its eyes saw through terrain they thought protected them. The Americans had changed the rules of the battlefield. The Apache's rotors finally echoed through the mountains, a low, distant rhythm. Too late to hide, too late to run. The valley no longer belonged to them. Long before it became a terror in the mountains of Afghanistan, the Apache was born on a different battlefield entirely, one that never erupted into open war but shaped every decision military planners made in the late 20th century. In the 1970s, the United States believed the next great conflict would unfold across the plains of Europe, where thousands of Soviet tanks were expected to surge across the border and overwhelm NATO forces. The question haunting American commanders was simple: how do you stop an armored advance of that size? The solution was not a faster jet or a heavier bomb. It was something more primal, a machine that flew low, struck hard, and survived whatever the enemy threw at it. The Army wanted an aircraft that could kill tanks the way a surgeon cuts with a scalpel: precise, deliberate, and unrelenting. And so the requirements for a new attack helicopter took shape. It must see at night, fight in bad weather, hover behind hills, survive direct hits, and kill heavy armor before those tanks ever spotted it? What emerged from those demands was the AH-64 Apache. Its designers created a flying fortress built around the pilot and weapons officer. The cockpit sat inside an armored shell of boron carbide and Kevlar capable of withstanding hits from heavy machine guns. The engines were placed far apart so a single strike couldn't take them both out. Critical systems were duplicated and isolated. If a hydraulic line failed on one side, another set would pick up the load. Even the rotor blades were designed to keep spinning after absorbing damage that would shatter those on lesser helicopters. But toughness was only half of the Apache's identity. The other half was lethality. At the center of this new weapon was a missile unlike anything used before, the AGM-114 Hellfire. Designed originally to defeat Soviet tanks with top-down kills, it carried a shaped charge warhead strong enough to punch through inches of reinforced armor. More importantly, it could strike from miles away, guided by a laser dot the enemy never saw. The Apache didn't have to close with its target. It didn't even have to reveal itself. It could rise briefly from behind a ridge, lace a tank with a laser, fire a missile, and sink back into cover, all before the enemy knew what had happened. When the helicopter entered service in the mid-1980s, it represented a radical shift in how wars could be fought. No longer did a pilot have to expose themselves to fire to attack armored units. No longer did enemy gunners have a chance to shoot back. The Apache could kill from a distance, vanish into darkness, and reappear without warning. Yet, for all its Cold War pedigree, the AH-64 was about to inherit a very different kind of war. Instead of the flat plains of Central Europe, it would be sent into a country of impossible terrain, Afghanistan. Here, the enemy did not come in neat formations. They were not driving columns of tanks. They did not rely on radar or armored vehicles. They hid in mountains, in caves, in villages, and among fields of stone. They knew the terrain intimately and believed it gave them a permanent advantage over any aircraft. When the United States invaded Afghanistan in late 2001, many analysts questioned whether a helicopter built to kill tanks had a place in a guerrilla war. Would its Hellfires be too specialized? Would its heavy armor matter? Would its sophisticated sensors be useful in a place where fighters blended seamlessly into the landscape? But the mountains revealed the Apache's hidden purpose. After decades spent preparing to fight Soviet armor, it turned out the helicopter's biggest strengths, its range, survivability, night vision systems, and ability to hover in tight spaces, made it ideal for counterinsurgency warfare. More than that, its standoff weapons negated the one advantage insurgents counted on: the shape of the land itself. The Taliban's earliest mistake was assuming the Apache had to get close, that its gun and rockets were its primary threat. They were wrong. The real danger was the invisible laser guiding a Hellfire missile from miles away, through winding valleys, onto positions fighters believed were untouchable. The Apache had not been designed for Afghanistan, but it fit the war perfectly. When the first Apaches arrived in Afghanistan after 9/11, they carried with them a reputation forged in the deserts of Iraq during the Gulf War. They had destroyed radar sites, guided waves of airstrikes, and torn apart armored columns. But Afghanistan was different. There were no tank battalions here, no armored spearheads, no radar arrays broadcasting from open plains. Instead, there were winding valleys, jagged peaks, hidden compounds, and enemies who could disappear into rock as easily as stepping through a doorway. At first, Taliban fighters weren't impressed. They assumed this new helicopter, this American machine rumored to be dangerous, operated like the Russian Hinds they had fought decades earlier. Big, loud, slow, and forced to descend into deadly ranges to fire rockets or guns. The Taliban had beaten the Soviets by exploiting terrain and ambush tactics. They believed they could do the same now. Their confidence didn't last. The early months of the war revealed something the Taliban had not anticipated. The Apache didn't need to see you to kill you, and it certainly didn't need to come close. Part of this revelation came from the aircraft's ability to hover behind cover. During nighttime missions, Apaches positioned themselves behind ridgelines, completely invisible to anyone on the ground, and used their infrared sensors to scan for heat signatures. Fighters huddled in rock formations, believing they were unseen, were suddenly illuminated in perfect clarity on the helicopter's displays. Some pilots described the experience as looking through time itself, caves glowing with the heat of recent activity, footsteps cooling on the ground, faint wisps of engine warmth trailing behind a motorcycle now hidden beyond a hill. The Apaches watched and waited. When U.S. ground forces needed support, the call came in. Coordinates, target type, terrain description. The helicopter would rise just high enough to establish a line of sight. A brief laser designation flickered invisibly across the battlefield. Then the missile fired. A quiet hiss, a glowing streak, a distant explosion. Just as quickly as it appeared, the Apache sank back into the shadows. The Taliban had no idea what hit them. One of the major turning points came during the early phases of Operation Anaconda in 2002. U.S. troops pushing into the Shah-i-Kot Valley found themselves under intense fire from Taliban fighters positioned along the slopes. The valley's geography created natural choke points and kill zones, perfect for ambushes and long-range machine gun nests. The Taliban believed these positions were safe because helicopters would have to fly directly into the valley floor to engage them. But that morning, Apaches arrived in pairs and took up positions behind opposite ridgelines. Using their sensors, they spotted muzzle flashes the ground troops couldn't see, machine guns hidden in cave mouths, RPG teams firing from slit-like openings in the cliff face, snipers perched above boulders, waiting for American soldiers to advance. The Apaches never entered the kill zone. Missiles struck from several miles away, eliminating the most dangerous positions. Taliban fighters felt the ground tremble and rocks explode outward but saw no aircraft overhead. Radio men shouted into their handsets, trying to understand how they were being targeted. Then they heard the rotors. Not loud, not close, just a distant thumping echoing across the valley. For many, that was the moment the truth became clear. The helicopter was somewhere behind the mountains, hidden, patient, and lethal at distances they never imagined possible. From that point forward, their tactics began to change. Fighters stopped gathering in large groups. They abandoned fixed firing positions. They burned out caves they once depended on, fearing the Apache's sensors could see inside. Some began digging trenches under tree canopies to stay hidden from above. Others simply refused to fire unless absolutely necessary, afraid a muzzle flash would betray their location. Meanwhile, on the American side, the helicopter's reputation among ground troops soared. Soldiers spoke with awe about Apaches that seemed to arrive out of nowhere, eliminating threats invisible to the naked eye. Medics recalled moments where the helicopter's intervention stopped ambushes before they unfolded. Infantrymen remembered the sudden silence after a Hellfire strike, gunfire fading, pressure lifting, hope returning. Through countless missions, the Apache transformed from a Cold War tank killer into something far more adaptable. A long-range executioner perfectly suited to a guerrilla battlefield. Each upgrade, new sensors, improved optics, better communication systems, expanded its reach. And with every engagement, Taliban fighters learned a hard lesson. Distance no longer guaranteed safety. The helicopter they once dismissed had evolved into a ghost that struck without warning, from a place they could not see, with weapons they could not outrun. But the mountains revealed the Apache's hidden purpose. After decades spent preparing to fight Soviet armor, it turned out the helicopter's biggest strengths, its range, survivability, night vision systems, and ability to hover in tight spaces, made it ideal for counterinsurgency warfare. More than that, its standoff weapons negated the one advantage insurgents counted on: the shape of the land itself. The Taliban's earliest mistake was assuming the Apache had to get close, that its gun and rockets were its primary threat. They were wrong. The real danger was the invisible laser guiding a Hellfire missile from miles away, through winding valleys, onto positions fighters believed were untouchable. The Apache had not been designed for Afghanistan, but it fit the war perfectly. In the early stages of the war, many Taliban fighters still believed they understood helicopters. They had defeated Soviet Hinds by exploiting valleys, hitting aircraft when they dipped too low, and ambushing them with RPGs and machine guns. To them, helicopters were visceral creatures, noisy, close-range hunters that had to expose themselves to deliver firepower. If they stayed high, they were harmless. If they descended, they were vulnerable. The equation felt simple. Their first encounters with the Apache seemed to confirm this view. A few early missions saw helicopters return to base scarred and battered, rotor blades splintered by gunfire, armor panels punctured by lucky RPG hits. Taliban fighters bragged to each other that the Americans were no better than the Russians. They said the Apache would bleed just like the Hind did. But beneath their confidence, a shift was already happening, so subtle at first that few noticed it. American pilots had learned quickly that the tactics they brought from training ranges in the United States were not suited to the steep cliffs and hidden firing positions of Afghanistan. The familiar attack patterns, pop-up maneuvers, rapid dives, traditional rocket and cannon strikes, left the helicopter exposed to well-placed ambushes. So the pilots adapted. They studied the terrain differently. They worked closely with special forces teams on the ground. They changed how they approached targets, when they chose to fire, and how they used the Hellfire missile. The first major turning point came when Apache crews realized they didn't need to put themselves in danger to destroy Taliban positions. The aircraft's sensors could pick up heat signatures from astonishing distances. Its optics could trace the faint flicker of a muzzle blast in the dark. And the Hellfire, with its guidance system and ability to ride a reflected laser beam, meant the Apache didn't even have to see the target directly. A ground team with a laser designator could point to a cave entrance the helicopter couldn't physically view, and the missile would follow the reflected signal with surgical precision. This made distance irrelevant. Taliban fighters hiding behind ridgelines, once confident that terrain shielded them, found themselves struck by missiles launched from helicopters still hidden behind mountains. Units positioned deep in valleys were destroyed before they heard rotors. Fighters radioed frantically, insisting they were under attack by jets or drones. They did not believe a helicopter could strike from so far away. The second turning point arrived during coordinated ambush attempts. Taliban fighters often set up complex kill zones in narrow valleys, waiting for U.S. patrols to walk into their line of fire. For years, guerrilla forces had relied on such tactics. But now, as soon as the first shots rang out, the Apaches responded, not by diving into the trap, but by rising just high enough to acquire a firing solution. Before the ambushers could adjust, Hellfire missiles were already in the air. Positions that had been prepared for days were erased in seconds. The fighters who survived these encounters described a sense of confusion unlike anything they had felt before. They had dug their positions carefully. They had memorized the angles. They had studied how helicopters behaved. Yet the attack came from directions that made no sense. It felt as though the Americans were watching from inside the rocks. The third turning point was psychological rather than tactical. Taliban radio operators began warning fighters not to fire first. A single muzzle flash could be the end of the entire unit. Some commanders ordered their men to hold fire until helicopters descended, something the Apache crews rarely needed to do anymore. Others tried to disperse fighters into smaller groups, thinking that a missile designed to kill tanks would not be used against a handful of men. They were wrong. The missile struck whatever the laser pointed at, whether it was a tank, a bunker, a sniper's window, or a lone figure on a ridge. Slowly, the belief that the Apache had to be close dissolved into something else. The realization that the helicopter could appear anywhere, attack from any direction, and do so without warning. The rotors were no longer the sound of danger. They were the confirmation that danger had already passed. For American pilots, the change was equally striking. Missions that once required risky maneuvers became calm, deliberate engagements executed from safe distances. They no longer needed to rush into the jaws of ambushes. They could hover behind cover, coordinate with ground forces, and neutralize threats systematically. Their respect for the helicopter's capabilities deepened as they watched it evolve from a tank hunter into an asymmetric warfare specialist. For the Taliban, however, the turning points were a series of unpleasant revelations. Helicopters weren't what they used to be. Terrain wasn't the shield they had believed in. And distance, once their strongest ally, had vanished. What remained was a battlefield rewritten by a machine they had underestimated. But the mountains revealed the Apache's hidden purpose. After decades spent preparing to fight Soviet armor, it turned out the helicopter's biggest strengths, its range, survivability, night vision systems, and ability to hover in tight spaces, made it ideal for counterinsurgency warfare. More than that, its standoff weapons negated the one advantage insurgents counted on: the shape of the land itself. The Taliban's earliest mistake was assuming the Apache had to get close, that its gun and rockets were its primary threat. They were wrong. The real danger was the invisible laser guiding a Hellfire missile from miles away, through winding valleys, onto positions fighters believed were untouchable. The Apache had not been designed for Afghanistan, but it fit the war perfectly. The war in Afghanistan became a collection of moments, small, violent collisions between fighters who believed they understood their battlefield, and an aircraft that rewrote their understanding in seconds. The Apache's story in these mountains was not about sweeping offensives or grand strategy. It was about the encounters that unfolded in narrow valleys, on wind-scoured ridges, beside hidden cave mouths, and in the half-light of dawn when the world held its breath. It is here, in these moments, that the helicopter's true legacy was forged. The winter sun had barely risen when American troops in the valley below called for help. A patrol had taken fire from a ridgeline that towered above them like a stone wall. Taliban fighters had picked their position well, a cluster of fortified nests carved into a slope so steep that climbing it would have been a death sentence. They believed no aircraft would dare approach the slope itself, where RPG teams could fire straight down on any helicopter that tried. The Apaches responded in minutes. The first helicopter drifted low, keeping its belly toward the valley floor, hiding its vulnerable underside. The second hovered behind a parallel ridge, unseen by the fighters above. Through thermal sensors and narrow field cameras, the crews saw the faint silhouettes of the positions that had pinned down the ground patrol. A muzzle flash appeared. The Apache behind the ridge locked the area instantly. Seconds later, a Hellfire arced across the gap. The Taliban gunner never saw it. The missile hit the rock face beside him with the force of a hammer breaking bone. The explosion echoed so loudly through the valley that American troops felt it tremble in their ribs. Another muzzle flash. Another missile. The positions that had seemed unassailable began collapsing one by one, their carefully prepared stones spilling downhill in clouds of dust. The Taliban fighters had not expected the helicopters to strike from behind terrain they could not see. As the survivors scrambled to reposition, the Apache in the valley finally rose high enough to bring its cannon into play. The sound of it cracked across the mountains like a tear in the air, and the first burst of 30mm fire shredded the rocks around the scrambling fighters. The ambush was over before it truly began. In another part of the country, the story took a different shape. A Taliban column, armed with captured heavy machine guns and a handful of technicals, attempted to maneuver toward an American base under cover of night. They believed darkness and rough terrain were their allies. For decades, fighters in Afghanistan relied on night as their protection, assuming the Americans, like the Soviets, were half blind in the dark. But the Apache thrived in darkness. Flying at low altitude, its pilots scanned the desert floor using night vision systems that painted the world in shades of white heat and black cold. The fighters couldn't hide their engines from the sensors. They couldn't mask the warmth of their bodies. They couldn't move across open terrain without leaving a trail. At first, the Apaches simply observed, tracking the column as it wove through dry riverbeds and cut across dunes. They waited, watched, reported. The fighters had no idea they were being hunted. The first missile came when the column stopped at a cluster of boulders, parking vehicles in a loose circle while their commander spoke to his men. A single pickup truck erupted in a ball of fire, throwing metallic fragments skyward. Fighters scattered instantly, some running toward rocks, others dropping to the ground. The second missile targeted the commander himself. The Apaches then descended, turning the desert into a maze of death. The cannon strikes were precise, deliberate. The rotor blades beat the air in slow, rhythmic pulses as the aircraft maneuvered, the night lit only by the flashes of impacts. Survivors fled into the darkness, but the Apaches tracked their heat signatures like wolves tracking prey. Within minutes, the column ceased to exist. When ground forces arrived hours later, they found the pickup truck still smoldering, and the sand fused into molten glass where the missiles had hit. Not every battle involved sweeping destruction. Some were terrifying tests of the Apaches' resilience. One helicopter operating near coast encountered two RPG teams hidden along a narrow pass. The first rocket hit the Apache's left side, blasting away armor and sending the aircraft into a violent roll. Warning lights flooded the cockpit. Smoke filled the cabin. The pilot fought to stabilize the helicopter, pushing the machine back into a level attitude through pure instinct and muscle memory. The second RPG team fired as the wounded helicopter tried to escape. The rocket struck the tail assembly, knocking out its stabilizer. The aircraft lurched again, the tail yawing wildly. Any other helicopter would have crashed, but the Apache refused. The pilot kept it airborne using every ounce of control the machine had left. Meanwhile, the second Apache in the formation immediately hunted down the ambushers. Guided by the infrared trail of the RPG launches, it fired a Hellfire into the exact spot the rockets originated. The explosion silenced both teams permanently. The damaged Apache limped back to base, landing in a shower of sparks as its skids scraped the ground. When maintenance crews inspected it, they counted dozens of penetrations. Armor plating twisted like melted tin, hydraulic lines severed, pieces of rotor blades missing, and part of the tail held together only by structural luck. And yet the aircraft had flown. It had brought its crew home. In the mountains near Asadabad, another kind of engagement unfolded, one that spoke to the psychological war taking shape. A group of Taliban fighters manned an observation post on a cliffside that overlooked a key valley used by U.S. patrols. From their vantage point, they could pick off soldiers with sniper fire and vanish before American forces could respond. They believed themselves invisible, but the Apaches learned their rhythm. They watched from afar, identifying when the fighters emerged from their concealed positions. For days, the helicopters remained silent observers. On the morning of the strike, the fighters stepped out to prepare their rifles. One adjusted his optics, another scanned the valley floor. A beam of invisible light touched the rocks near their feet. The Hellfire struck before they realized they had been targeted. Fragments tore across the ledge. Dust billowed upward in a thick cloud. When the air cleared, the observation post was gone. The cliff face bore a new scar, a jagged crater that seemed to gouge into the mountain's heart. Another story traveled through Taliban ranks like a whispered warning. A group of fighters attempted to ambush a convoy, positioning themselves behind large rocks to fire on the lead vehicle. When the first shots rang out, the Apaches responded. But instead of diving into range of the ambushers, they rose just high enough to fire rockets over the ridge. The weapons arced upward, disappeared from sight, then descended in a perfect curve, detonating behind the rocks where the fighters had taken cover. One survivor described it simply, "We hid from the helicopter. The helicopter hid from us, but the missiles found us." American infantrymen who witnessed these engagements never forgot what they saw. To them, the Apache became a symbol of survival. They spoke of the aircraft in tones usually reserved for myth. They described the cannon's bursts as the sound of hope arriving. They recalled moments when they were pinned under machine gun fire, and the shadow of an Apache drifted across the valley floor, slow, calm, steady, as if the helicopter itself were reassuring them. You are not alone. The moment of impact was unpredictable. There was no buildup, no distant warning, no visible aircraft approaching. A cave entrance would simply vanish in fire. A machine gun nest would erupt in smoke, A sniper position would disappear from existence. Entire groups of fighters reported hearing a sudden blast without any indication they had been targeted. One Taliban survivor recalled, "We heard no helicopter, only the explosion, only the shouting after." Word of these silent strikes spread quickly. Fighters who once trained to ambush helicopters now learned that the helicopter did not need to come close at all. They began asking questions they couldn't answer. How far away can it see? How far away can it shoot? How does it know where we are? Fear grew from the unknown. Radio transmissions captured by American forces revealed the growing anxiety. Taliban commanders warned their fighters not to gather in groups, not to light fires at night, not to use elevated terrain unless absolutely necessary. Men who once prided themselves on their mountain instincts now hesitated to stand near cave entrances or rocky overhangs for fear that a sensor might be fixed on them. The absence of the helicopter became as unnerving as its presence. During long stretches of silence, fighters whispered among themselves that the Americans were watching. Shadows in valleys became possible threats. Reflections on rock faces, harmless sunlight, were mistaken for laser designators. One fighter described the constant tension. "At night, I heard things that were not there. I thought the helicopter was behind every mountain." Meanwhile, American ground troops experienced the opposite. The Apache became a psychological anchor. Soldiers pinned in firefights described the moment they first heard the deep rhythmic beat of its rotors cutting through the sky. Even before it fired, morale shifted. Fear turned into confidence. Chaos turned into coordination. The sound meant protection, precision, and overwhelming firepower. Some units joked that the Apache was a flying lie detector. If the enemy kept shooting, the helicopter would find them. If the shooting stopped, they knew the enemy was either gone or hiding somewhere that wouldn't save them for long. In fierce engagements, soldiers remembered feeling the shockwave of 30mm rounds impacting near enemy positions. They felt the earth jump beneath their boots. They remembered looking up and seeing the silhouette of the helicopter moving with slow, deliberate menace, as if it had all the time in the world. Taliban fighters felt that same shockwave, but to them, it signaled the end. Over time, the psychological divide became one of the most decisive aspects of the war. One side feared the Apache even when it wasn't there. The other felt invincible the moment it arrived. War is not just fought with weapons. It is fought with perception, expectation, and belief. In Afghanistan, the Apache didn't just dominate terrain, it dominated the mind. The Apache's dominance in Afghanistan was not an accident of circumstance. It was the result of a philosophy that blended technology, resilience, and battlefield adaptability into a single, relentless machine. To understand why the helicopter became so decisive, one must look at the combination of qualities that allowed it to bend the battlefield to its will. The first was reach. The Hellfire missile, originally conceived as a tank killer, allowed the Apache to operate from distances that insurgents never anticipated. In a country defined by mountains and deep valleys, this mattered more than anyone predicted. The terrain that shielded fighters from Soviet gunships became irrelevant when a missile could arc over ridgelines and detonate with pinpoint accuracy. The Taliban believed the mountains were their armor. The Hellfire made the mountains meaningless. Then there was the matter of visibility. The Apache was built from the beginning to own the night. Its sensor suite, thermal cameras, low-light systems, advanced optics, allowed it to see where human eyes failed. The Taliban's natural instinct to rely on darkness became a vulnerability. Even when fighters hid inside caves or behind rock formations, their body heat betrayed them. At times, pilots could track footsteps still glowing faintly on the ground. The helicopter saw everything, and seeing meant killing. Survivability further enhanced its impact. The Apache absorbed damage that would cripple any ordinary aircraft. Its dual-engine separation, armored cockpit, redundant hydraulics, and toughened rotor system meant that even severe hits often failed to down it. Stories spread among American troops of Apaches returning with tail sections barely attached, blades chipped by shrapnel, engines bleeding oil, and yet still flying. Each of these stories grew into legend. The helicopter did not die easily, and when a machine refuses to die, it becomes central to strategy. For ground commanders, the Apache became a hinge point for maneuvers. They planned patrols knowing the helicopter could arrive quickly. They executed raids confident that overhead protection would stay for hours. They advanced into valleys, secure in the knowledge that if ambushed, help would not just come, it would come with overwhelming force. In this sense, the Apache did more than kill the enemy. It expanded the battlefield options available to American forces. Precision was another key to its strategic significance. Unlike fast jets that delivered ordnance at speed, an Apache could hover, adjust, and correct. A pilot could coordinate with a soldier with a laser pointer on the ground and strike a single room in a compound while leaving the surrounding structure untouched. In urban fighting, in tight mountain passes, in villages where civilians lived inches from insurgents, this level of control changed the nature of the war. It meant the U.S. could apply pressure without carpet bombing entire districts. It meant insurgents could not hide behind civilian structures with impunity. The helicopter also acted as a bridge between ground forces and air power. It carried communication systems that allowed it to orchestrate complex engagements, relaying target data, marking enemy lines, and directing additional airstrikes. In many battles, the Apache was not just a hunter, it was a battlefield commander in the air. Finally, the aircraft's presence altered Taliban strategy entirely. Fighters abandoned vehicles. They stopped using ridgetop nests. They avoided staying in one place. Their most powerful defensive advantage, the terrain, was eroded by the Apache's ability to turn that terrain into a killing ground. Taliban units learned to scatter, to hide, to dig deeper than ever before. But even then, they could seldom outrun the helicopter's reach. The Apache did not merely outperform its original Cold War mission. In Afghanistan, it became something new, a precision engine of asymmetric warfare capable of reducing ambushes, strongholds, and mobile units with the same relentless efficiency. No enemy tactic remained effective for long. The helicopter reshaped how the Taliban fought and how American troops survived. Taliban fighters felt that same shockwave, but to them, it signaled the end. Over time, the psychological divide became one of the most decisive aspects of the war. One side feared the Apache even when it wasn't there. The other felt invincible the moment it arrived. War is not just fought with weapons. It is fought with perception, expectation, and belief. In Afghanistan, the Apache didn't just dominate terrain, it dominated the mind. When the long war in Afghanistan stretched from months into years, fighters on both sides carried memories that would shape how they fought each new day. For the Taliban, those memories often centered on a single silhouette. Twin engines glowing like eyes in the dark, rotors chopping the air with slow confidence, a machine that refused to be chased away by darkness, mountains, or fear. For American troops, that silhouette meant survival. For the Taliban, it meant something else entirely: inevitability. As the conflict evolved, so did the Apache. Early in the war, the AH-64A and D models already commanded the battlefield with sensors and Hellfire missiles that Taliban fighters found impossible to outmaneuver. But as the years progressed, upgrades sharpened the helicopter's lethality even further. New navigation systems, improved optics, better communications, and advanced targeting pods expanded the aircraft's range and clarity. What was once a powerful hunter became a nearly omniscient presence, capable of identifying a rifle barrel from miles away. The introduction of data link technology strengthened its partnership with drones and ground units. A Predator could track a group of fighters, pass their location digitally to an Apache miles away, and within minutes, a missile would streak across the sky toward a target the helicopter's crew had never even seen with the naked eye. The battlefield shrank. The distance at which the Taliban felt safe evaporated. Some fighters adapted by abandoning vehicles. knowing that anything with an engine was a glowing beacon in the Apache's thermal sights. They traveled on foot, dispersed in small units, and used the terrain with desperate caution. They hid during daylight and moved only in short bursts. But none of this solved the fundamental problem. The helicopter didn't need to chase them. It needed only to wait for a mistake. One such mistake occurred near Sangin, in the rugged heart of Helmand province. A Taliban commander ordered his fighters to regroup in an abandoned compound before launching an evening attack on a marine patrol route. The men arrived one by one, slipping through doorways and ducking under archways, confident they had avoided detection. The compound was old, its walls thick, its entryway shielded from aerial view. They believed themselves concealed. But a reconnaissance drone, circling thousands of feet above, noticed faint heat blooming inside the building. Too many signatures clustered too closely together. It passed the coordinates to an Apache orbiting miles to the west. The helicopter adjusted course, flew behind a ridge, and slowed to a hover. From there, hidden from the ground entirely, it lazed the corner of the compound. The Hellfire arrived not through the doorway, but through the roof. The explosion blew the structure inward, collapsing wooden beams and sending dust billowing into the twilight sky. When ground forces arrived hours later, they found no weapons outside, no vehicles nearby, no visible sign the fighters had even been there. Only the crater in the roof revealed what had happened. The Taliban had trusted the earth to shield them. The Apache treated the earth as if it were glass. Stories like this echoed across Afghanistan. Fighters described engagements where the helicopter seemed to strike from impossible angles, firing missiles that curved over peaks, cannon shells that stitched across ridgelines, rockets that plunged downward onto mountain shelves. The terrain they had mastered for decades was no longer theirs. It belonged to whichever direction the Apache chose to view it from. The psychological fallout was profound. Taliban commanders reported increasing difficulty convincing recruits to man strongholds or prepare ambushes in open valleys. Some fighters refused to use caves, fearing the helicopter's sensors could detect the warmth of their breath in the darkness. Entire units relocated repeatedly, digging positions in places so remote they lacked consistent supply. Fear reshaped their tactics as thoroughly as any airstrike. Meanwhile, American troops grew accustomed to calling the Apache not just for fire support, but for reassurance. Soldiers pinned down behind low walls or trapped in tight wadis often radioed with urgency. "Where's the Apache?" When the pilot's voice crackled over the net, calm, steady, clinical, it changed everything. One infantry squad leader said, "You could feel the fear leaving the guys the moment that voice came through." Another remembered lying in the dirt as tracer rounds snapped overhead, hearing the thump of rotors approaching. "I knew we weren't dying that day." The Apache became more than a machine, more than the sum of its armor panels, redundant systems, sensors, or missiles. It became a promise, a contract, a guardian that arrived when the world narrowed to gunfire and fear. But in the end, its legacy in Afghanistan is defined just as much by the enemy it broke as the soldiers it saved. Taliban fighters who once dismissed the helicopter saw it evolve in real time, from a conventional attack aircraft to a ghost-like striker capable of eliminating targets from beyond sight and sound. One former fighter, interviewed years after the battles in Helmand, described his realization, "We thought the Americans needed to see us to kill us, but the Apache saw everything." Another put it even more simply, "You never fear what you see, you fear what you cannot." By the time the most advanced variant, the AH-64E Guardian, entered the theater, the transformation was complete. Faster, more powerful, better connected, and armed with even more precise munitions, it represented a new generation of air dominance. The helicopter that had once been designed to face Soviet armor now coordinated with drones, jets, satellites, and reconnaissance teams in a web of intelligence the Taliban could never hope to match. Hellfire missiles extended their range. Data links allowed real-time target sharing. Even the rotor system improved, giving the aircraft more agility in thin mountain air. For the Taliban, nothing fundamental changed. The helicopter remained the same silent, distant executioner that struck from beyond the horizon. Only now it could strike even farther, even faster, even more precisely. And its pilots, seasoned by years of combat, approached each new mission with the experience of thousands of sorties and the confidence of countless lives saved. History often remembers weapons by their statistics, their ranges, armor thickness, payloads. But the Apache's legacy cannot be reduced to numbers. It lives in the memories of Marines who watched it turn the tide of battles. It lives in the accounts of soldiers who heard its cannon end firefights that should have claimed their lives. It lives in the fear of the fighters who once mocked it, then ran from it, then hid from it, then suffered under its fire anyway. And most of all, it lives in the understanding that the Apache wasn't feared because it was loud or fast or imposing. It was feared because it made distance irrelevant, because it struck without warning, because it rendered terrain meaningless. The fighters who believed they could vanish into the mountains learned too late that the Apache could see through the mountains. The helicopter they once dismissed came to shape an entire era of warfare, an era defined by precision, persistence, and a machine whose Hellfire missiles could reach farther than any fear they had ever known. The battlefield belonged to whoever could strike first, from wherever they chose. In Afghanistan, that belonged to the Apache. Taliban fighters felt that same shockwave, but to them, it signaled the end. Over time, the psychological divide became one of the most decisive aspects of the war. One side feared the Apache even when it wasn't there. The other felt invincible the moment it arrived. War is not just fought with weapons. It is fought with perception, expectation, and belief. In Afghanistan, the Apache didn't just dominate terrain. It dominated the mind.